Hey everybody. See some familiar faces, some of you from previous LambdaConf, some of you from Twitter. Definitely nice, definitely in 2015, I didn't know any of you. So a little about me. I come from a somewhat non-traditional background. I have no degree in CS, I have no degree in anything. I couldn't afford to go to school. I had to go straight to work. I've got about 10 years working in software, but the first 2 years were pretty rough. I was just kind of catching .NET contracts as I could, right? Eventually I realized I had to get that out of the Midwest or I was never going to get anywhere. Eventually in New York I was able to get things going. But 10 years working in software, maybe more like 8. You can decide how you want to count it. Mostly as an individual contributor. Anybody work at a company with like an IC kind of group level contributor tracking thing? Some people have a more fluid kind of transition between those two. Facebook has that. You know, if you're an IC, you're just a normal programmer. But some people are programmers that transition to being team leads, managers, that kind of thing. So I'm mostly IC. Technically, I've been a CTO once, but when you're a CTO of like a 5-person company, you're not a CTO. Responsible for hiring and training off and on. Not really a hiring manager, just, you know, programmer who seems to be able to talk to people. That's about the extent of it. It's a wonderful skill. If you want to, like, you know, increase your career success, just get used to talking to people. So I'm known mostly for having co-written the Haskell book with Julie. I've used and taught Haskell for about 4 years, used it professionally for 2.5. And God bless the first person that gave me a chance on that one, because they got the worst tutorial on applicative I've ever given. They still switched their company to Haskell, and they hired me to help them move over. So Alex, thank you. So I'm not actually going to be talking about people who can't code, because really what we're just talking about is somebody who hasn't learned to code. What I'm going to be talking about people who work as programmers, but they only really know just enough to get things done, right? They're useful, they're hireable, but they're not super independent, they can't really do new things by themselves. So, some of you have probably worked with, you know, all of us have been Johnny. I should just say this up front so that, you know, people don't think I'm like othering like a particular category of permanent, you know, lumpen proletariat or something like that. It's, all of us has been this, you know, whenever you're in an unfamiliar environment, you know, you're learning a new programming language, this is you right now. You can really like, take the Rust community, they do a great job of this. One of the kind of rituals for a new Rust programmer is to try to get at least one patch into Servo, just to kind of break that seal, right? Servo's their experimental browser that's kind of a test bed for Rust, but also might maybe someday become a next generation browser. And this is actually a really good community practice because they actually offer a lot of support to people who do this. They mark out tickets as being relatively accessible to new people, and they give them a ton of help in IRC, on the discourse, and in GitHub. And that kind of community support is really important for moving people out of that stage. The problem is when you stick to just working on predefined tasks within a well-defined space. All right, who here has ever used Rails? Yeah, all right. I said this the other day and everybody looked at me like I was crazy. All right, so I've used Rails before. Most of my work was in Python and Django before I, you know, kind of returned home to Lisp and then eventually Haskell. So one of the nice things about Rails is you don't ever have to actually write any code, right? You can just program by Stack Overflow. Just keep copy and pasting. I think somebody even made like a little joke utility where you could just say, you know, get it from Stack Overflow. I forget the name of the utility, I apologize. And then just type in a query and it'll just dump the code for you. Doesn't even bother to show any context, just here's the answer, right? But if we're being honest, all of us do this just to save time. All of us, right? I mean, unless you're doing R&D, which, who gets to do that, right? We all do this. But what happens when that predefined answer doesn't exist, right? And that's my concern, is that we're growing a increasingly years of experience, you know, people who have more and more years of experience, there's more and more of people who really only work in that mode, who don't know how to break out of it. Another kind of anti-pattern that seems to be associated with this is never upstreaming patches. This deeply concerns me. I know people who use my libraries of friends of mine. They've run into bugs, they might mention it, never a patch. Maybe they fixed it, maybe they didn't. I don't even know what they did. What happened? Did the bug go away? Right? Did they even fix it? And the truth of the matter is that if you're working in a very popular ecosystem like Java, if a library has a bug or doesn't have a feature you want, do you actually fix it? No, you play library rotato until it has the right combination of features and, well, less visible bugs. That's basically what you're selecting for, is bugs you don't know about, right? The problem is that it's even worse than that. It's even worse than what I said. Because our industry's priorities are now wrapped around accommodating people who are pretty comfortable staying there. Because if you're already making 6 figures, what do you care, right? And the God's honest truth is, almost all of us are overpaid. I don't know a single person in here who has worked nearly as hard as a doctor. I know programmers who make more than pediatricians. That is obscene. I'm not saying we should get paid less. I'm saying we should... Hey, I like money too. The book isn't free, right? I like money too. But we should consider that, kind of a moral imperative to live up to the economic value we're extracting out of the companies we work at, the societies we live in. I mean, if we're going to drive up rents, we could at least do our jobs well, right? So all the industry seems to care about lately is how best can we accommodate Johnny? What are some programming languages that took off recently? Nobody's going to like this part. Node.js and Go, right? What do they optimize for? 0 to blog. That's what they optimize for. They don't optimize for something that's maintainable. They don't optimize for letting people build abstractions that work. I mean, Golang's claim to fame is Rob Pike and a fast compile time. Okay. So it's this extreme, strong time preference. So is anybody familiar with time preference? A couple people. Okay. So time preference is simply the idea of how much immediacy factors in to how much you value something. If you've ever read like a psychological behavioral economics study, this is a lot of what they're studying. Will the child take 1 cookie now, 2 cookies later? Will you invest your money now, or are you going to spend it? Right? Same idea. This applies to our engineering decisions too. This applies to the tools we use. It applies to how we actually build our projects. We have optimized for what is marketable in a maybe 200-word blog post that could have been a tweet. And that's what we reward. And if we keep rewarding this, it's as much as we deserve. This isn't a problem we can hire out of either. It's not going to go away just by being a little choosier in your hiring. For one thing, we don't know how to interview well. We're really bad at identifying who's actually effective. And not just effective in an individual sense. How many of you have worked at a company where in any other context you've been productive, happy, you got things done, but you just were in the wrong environment, right? And you just couldn't, you were stressed out, you couldn't really get anything done, you felt powerless, right? Because if there's anything about a process that makes a programmer upset, it's a process that makes them feel powerless. Like they can't actually make any decisions, they're just kind of taking inputs and turning them into code, right? And a lot of interview practices are odious. Demanding free labor of people trying to find a job, not really a fan. Now, I'm a little bit of a hypocrite on this. Bear with me. So I've used homework problems as an interview filter before. But I should qualify that statement. They weren't meant to take more than an hour. We would give them 24 hours to do it, and we let them tell us when they were ready. We didn't just deploy it on them and say, hey, right? And it just wasn't meant to be labor intensive, just tricky enough, but also realistic enough that it still worked. So in this context, the homework problem I'm thinking of was at a company using Haskell. ad tech company. Now, how many of you use pipes? Haskell pipes, the pipes library for Haskell. I forget that there's actually people who don't use Haskell here. I actually do. All right, so streaming library, right? Lets you incrementally process data without blowing up your heap. Pretty simple. All right, how many of you have ever wrote a function that can just take an average of a stream of data? Fair few, okay. And okay, so the homework problem was just take a stream of data, of inputs, these events, representing something you might get in, say, a click stream, right? But very simple. And just give us an average and a count for the stream. That's it. At the time we were hiring for the job, we got about, I want to say 30, 40 applicants. Only 2 actually completed the homework successfully. One of the people who failed to complete the homework successfully has been in the Haskell community for over 10 years. But what are they actually doing with their time? That becomes the important part. Are they just hanging out in IRC, chit-chatting? Or are they actually working? Unfortunately, most employers aren't going to pay you to learn Haskell or whatever it is you want to learn. Some cover conferences. That's great, right? We're all here. But not all employers do. Thinking you can just hire only the best is pretty unrealistic. We don't have a good way of knowing what interview practices work better than others. The companies that have a more structured and organized interviewing process still have interviewing processes that seem pretty dysfunctional. Google comes to mind. They even recognize that some of their past practices didn't work all that well, but they didn't really have a game plan for, okay, what now? You can't actually be picky about your hires indefinitely. Definitely when, if you're in a younger startup, you can be pickier about your hires. You're probably working with people you just know. So you're working with some really excellent people early on. But over time, you're going to hire more inexperienced people, people that maybe didn't have jobs that allowed them to grow as much, right? And when everybody else hires only the best, what differentiates you? What are you doing that actually makes that work? Why are you going to be the one company that succeeds at hiring the best when everybody else is trying to do the same thing? At that point, that's not a strategy, it's just a prayer. You're praying. Pray to Forbes. Pray to the Harvard Business School. And even worse, there's no competitive advantage here for trying to hire the best because everybody else is doing the same thing. There's nothing there to differentiate you. The only people for whom it's really going to work for are people that can attract talent. They're not actually selecting for talent. They think they are. They're attracting talent. People who are skilled, experienced, have interesting specializations, they just want to work for these companies. Like Apple. How many of you are familiar with what the average salaries are like at Apple? Anybody? You should look sometime. They pay their people less than most startups with under 50 people in the Bay Area. Why? Because they can. Because they can. Because they're not just building yet another web app. Because they have interesting problems. And, maybe the reality distortion field just kind of got planted there permanently. Even if you're willing to just churn through hires, you're mortgaging your future. Your more experienced people, your more senior people, generally they're going to be older, right? What do people do as they get older? They start having families and they start caring about job security and not working for some megalomaniac. Burden churn is going to flush those people out. All you're going to get left with is that undergrad you hired last year. Okay, if you think that's going to work. And what we're not willing to admit is that our work is really boring. And a lot of it is very easy. I do not use Haskell because my work is hard. It's not. It's not. I make web apps that talk to databases. I make little queue workers that talk to databases. That's most of my work. Occasionally the ad tech stuff got a little interesting because of performance constraints, which, you know, is where people who couldn't hack it in finance go so they can still feel like they're playing in the market. So our work is boring and easy. So why is it so expensive and unpredictable? Well, that's not this talk, but I'll suggest that maybe FP has some answers there, right? Some people find a niche, they find a comfortable niche, they can do something, but they don't really need to grow out of that. That's fine, it won't last forever. Just ask a COBOL programmer. Actually, there is one thing, there's some insurance companies in Columbus, Ohio. If you're willing to, you know, mortgage your future, you could get $200 an hour contracting in COBOL, but it's basically dead time in your career, so any learning you want to do is going to happen off hours. One of the other concerns is that people will learn new tools, but they're not really building lasting skills, right? Learning how to use a Golang channel doesn't teach me how the pi calculus works. I can't take Golang channels with me. And I'm going to alienate some people here. I can't really take Haskell with me either. I don't benefit from knowing Haskell unless I'm using it. I know some of you are learning Haskell because you want to get better at your job, at, you know, your 9 to 5. If that is what you believe, then I heartily encourage it. But for me personally, I'm kind of dumb. The way I write Haskell is I'm just fencing with the compiler, right? That's what I do. I am a monkey that hits :R and GCI until it goes. Another problem is that coders don't really know how to learn. If you speak English, are you an English teacher? No. The answer is no. Okay? So just because you know how to code doesn't mean you know how to teach programming. It actually doesn't mean you know how to teach at all. Teaching is really, really hard. And it's a specialization in and of itself. It's not something you can just drop into when you need to get somebody up on something. I'm not saying you should forego teaching. What I am asking is that people approach it with a serious sense of purpose, that you pay attention to how effective you're being, that you think about the effect your teaching has on people. Another thing is knowledge. Okay, history in the United States as it's taught in schools. You learn facts. You recite facts. This happened and this happened and this happened. You have these pre-digested narratives fed to you. What are you actually learning about history? If you want to learn history, you should learn the historical method, how historians actually work. If you want to learn the Lens library, don't go through a pre-digested tutorial. Learn how the Lens developers actually iterated on the design, what they were basing it on, and why they're using profunctor, because who knows what profunctors are really for, right? Actually, I have some idea, but that's how you find out. You learn how to research and develop these answers for yourself. It's that process of learning how to learn without somebody feeding you pre-digested material, that's what makes you grow. Not knowing that profunctors are characterizing a particular feature of functions. I can tell you that means nothing. Who cares? Another problem is that, and I've touched on this in a previous talk, we create false narratives about how we learned. I don't think I've been more irritated with somebody than when somebody who didn't know any math, no mathematical maturity, came to them and said, how do I learn category theory? And the recommendation they dumped on them was McLean. Don't do that. That is a training manual for a grad student. That is not something for a looky-loo programmer who wants to dip in and see what the fuss is about. Use the red book for that, Levere. I mean, some of the questions are posed in a confusing way, but it's the most approachable one. So they'll recommend books and resources that are designed to make them look smart, regardless of whether or not it was actually how they learned. Do you think that person that recommended McLean just jumped into McLean and learned category theory from that? I don't think so. I know what they did. They had a really slow job. at a large company where they didn't have any work. And they spent about 1.5 years getting paid to just learn category theory. I don't have 1.5 years of 9 to 5 to learn category theory. Accordingly, I do not know category theory at all. Oh, I think Weigly explained adjunctions to me once. There you go, sorry. And Komet Koyoneda. Teaching is a skill in and of itself. It's something you have to take seriously. One of the problems with learning to teach is this idea that if we just advocate egolessness, suddenly everyone becomes egoless. You know, your ego isn't driving you. You're not trying to protect your ego instead of learning. I have made mistakes. I have been bad at teaching. I had to get through that process to get better at teaching. The problem is the teacher isn't the only thing. It's the student. If you don't get accurate feedback from the student, you're not going to know what works. If they're just nodding their head and saying, yep, got it, good, because they don't want to be embarrassed or because they're in a context they don't feel comfortable in, they're not going to learn, and neither are you. Making people feel comfortable and safe is an important component of teaching. It is critical. If they don't feel safe to be honest with you and to essentially expose their weakness to you, they're just going to say, yeah, whatever. So you can give somebody the treatment, the brain dump, makes you look real smart, just info dump, right? But they're going to be so embarrassed about feeling so stupid, about having all this information dumped on them rapidly, they'll just say, yep, I got it, cool. They're not going to admit to you that they aren't understanding it. Which leads into why there's this trope on Hacker News right now about not telling people something is easy. Stop. It's always not going to be easy for someone, depending on their context. It's a useless thing to say. You're not actually communicating anything. It's either worth learning or it's not. It's going to be easy for some people and hard for others. It doesn't matter. It's either worth learning or it's not. Is there maybe an ROI cutoff on time investment? Sure. But you need to trust the student and gauge that for themselves. You can't decide that for them. Another problem is talking, which is what I'm doing right now. I apologize. Talking doesn't teach. It doesn't teach. Who here remembers in elementary school, the parts of the tongue that have like sweetness and sour and bitter? Anybody get that little graph? Yeah, your elementary school teacher lied to you. Here's another lie they told you. That some people are kinesthetic learners or visual learners or auditory learners. There is no such thing. There are no types of learners. There is more effective pedagogy and less effective pedagogy. That's it. Do you need to know alternative ways of presenting something? Absolutely. There's still enough variables in the system that you're going to see different outcomes with different people. So, I'll give you an example. The only reason I know how to teach at all, is because of IRC. Freenode, IRC. Who here knows what IRC is? Okay, that's a fair few. If you didn't raise your hand, don't feel embarrassed. It's pretty bad time sink. So just old text-based chat client, right? A lot of programmers still use it. They seem to mostly use it to emotionally abuse each other, but sometimes something useful comes out of it. It appears some of that emotional abuse has transitioned to Twitter. It's a little unfortunate. So there's a Haskell IRC channel, which I didn't start, and there's a Haskell Beginners channel on Freenode IRC, which I did start. And in Haskell Beginners, I learned from excellent teachers. I only learned how to teach functor because I was able to watch them work with a student, and I got these different ideas for different explanations. It is only by seeing these examples and learning from them that I was able to do that. Now, does that mean there is one true functor explanation? No, it does not. There is a most likely to work explanation, perhaps. But you still need to run it like a priority ordered list. First explanation doesn't work, give them a moment, go to the next explanation. Right? But the problem is the way most people teach is they get one explanation that they kind of like, probably because it makes them sound smart, and then nothing ever changes. It just stays there. And the student just keeps nodding their head and saying, yep, got it. The other problem is that talking doesn't actually, that's not how people learn. The way people learn is they have to actually work. You can read about strength training all you want. You won't get any stronger doing it. Your brain's not any different. You have to do work. You can't just read a book. If you've bought our book, you're not supposed to read it. You're supposed to work through it. Toni Morris's NICTA course is actually a great example of this. It's mostly exercises, right? That's the right thing. That is precisely the right thing. You have to work. If you don't want to do exercises, then it's not that important to you. Go watch TV. That'll be more fun. When talking helps most, going back to IRC, students show up, they have a problem, they're stuck on something, right? They're asking questions designed to help them get unstuck. Now, what's visible? What are you seeing if you're just sitting in IRC? You're seeing people asking questions and seeming to learn something. What is missed is that this only works because they were doing all that work off of IRC. The dialogues work when it's designed to help you get over a hump in some course that you're going through or some problem you're working with. Nobody goes to Stack Overflow to say, teach me Ruby. They're saying, hey, I got this Rails app. I'm trying to do something. This isn't working. What am I supposed to do? Right? Another problem is time. If you're doing something 1 hour a week, like learning a programming language, you're not going to learn the programming language. You'll get to say you're learning a programming language. If that's enough, great. If you want to actually use it, you're going to have to put in more time than that. The other problem is it's actually really difficult to just have people go into training, learn something, and then be done. My co-author and I did this last year at LambdaConf. We offered 2-day training. Do I think it was worth their time? Absolutely. But what they should have done after the training is then done the rest of our book and done the rest of the exercises we couldn't cover in the training. If the only thing they did was the training, probably not a good use of money, not even from us. That time spent talking to someone is useless if you're not actually working on something. You can't go to a strength trainer and say, hey, I'm having this problem with my squat, and they ask you what's going on, and you tell them, well, I haven't been squatting. It's not going to work. They can't work in your squat form unless you're squatting, right? Another problem is that our industry is really bad at writing. We have some of the worst books of any profession I've ever seen. It's really bad, and if you happen to be near O'Reilly's offices, consider burning it down. They should just run conferences and be more honest with themselves about what their business actually is. They do not write books that teach. They write books for educational voyeurism. It is a waste of time. Don't buy the books. Don't pirate the book. Don't pirate my book either. It's a waste of time. The books are terrible. There's better resources on GitHub for free, much of the time, right? And which resources on GitHub are going to be effective? The ones doing squawky? No, the exercises. One of the problems is the way we develop these books. Basically, an editor is pleading and begging a programmer to actually finish the project they contracted to finish. That isn't what happened with the publisher I fired. That was something else. They had a real hard time with the word functor. Wasn't a good fit. Gave him a shot. You're just begging this person to just finish the project they contracted to finish, right? You don't have time to really do any pedagogical review when it's like that. When Julie and I were working on the book, the first tester of each chapter was Julie. When we were finished bouncing the chapter between her and I, it then went through private review. Then we would push the chapters live about once a month. And then we would get public feedback. We have a support line for the book. We're almost up to 2,000 emails. I've read, or at least looked at, all of them. Except for, there were some. There were some I didn't look at. Well, Julie's working on them too, right? So she handled some of them. So, I don't know of any tech author that's done anything like that. This was the first book I've ever written. This was the first book Julie had ever written. Is there anything about two first-time authors writing a 1,200-page book right out of the gate that tells you, yes, very highly likely to succeed? Right? Yeah, it's bizarre, right? It's not us. It's not me. It's not Julie. It's the process. It's caring that much that we produce a resource that is actually effective. If somebody didn't understand something once, fine. But that old saying, 3 times is enemy action. Don't repeat yourself. Once it happens 3 times, refactor. That's basically what we did, just with human feedback. No publisher does this. Although, shout out to No Starch, they have some good stuff. Guy that runs No Starch is awesome. So, programmers are kind of literate. Kind of. I mean, you know, literate in the sense that they can read signage. They can maybe read code they wrote recently. Maybe. Depends on whether or not you were in your bomber peak or not, right? But they can't really read. When we talk about literacy for just normal text, what are we talking about? Are we talking about signage? Are we talking about Moby Dick? It's probably closer, right? Doesn't have to be Moby Dick. Herman Melville's it's a little purplish prose. It's not worth it. All right. So, I'm a rube. Sorry. The problem is that if programmers don't have this pre-digested documentation with copy-pastable examples, they're just not going to use the library most of the time. Well, I have news for you. If you want to start using Haskell, I know that's not all of you, but if you'd like to start using Haskell, that's not going to work. They don't write documentation. Not for you, not for themselves. If you have a library that you need to solve a problem, you're just going to have to sit down and read the code. Not for everything. A lot of the more common stuff does have documentation, but it's going to happen. What happens then? You just stop being able to do your job? And this is part of the problem. A lot of programmers are accustomed to never actually being forced to learn how to read code. And reading here doesn't just mean like being this, very short tape that continually overwrites itself. You forget what you read 5 lines ago and you just remember this current line of code. You need to be able to actually extract patterns and build your mental model of the library yourself. That is closer to what I would call knowing a programming language or being a programmer. And this is pretty serious. I mean, you're not going to grow much as a developer if this is where you're at. This could be where you're at with a new programming language, and if that's a temporary thing and you've overcome that before, then that's great. But you want to really think very seriously about this if you've never actually sat down and learned a library just by reading the code. I encourage you to do this. It'll be better than reading an O'Reilly book. Another problem with not reading code is that this happens in every programming language, right? But most of the idiom and patterns in Haskell that have made me really like writing Haskell have come from just reading libraries. I got MTL style from Komet's Quine project. MTL style, not the library, different thing, right? MTL style makes me extremely happy because it lets me dip into these debates people have on monad transformers, chuckle, and go back to work. Just not a problem anymore, right? It's really nice. But I wouldn't have discovered it if I hadn't been reading the code. Employers aren't doing their part either. I'm not just going to dunk on publishers. They expect highly skilled programmers to drop out of the sky for dollar store prices, right? Everybody complains there's not enough programmers, not enough programmers. That's not actually true. There are plenty of programmers. You're just not willing to pay them the market rate. And you're not willing to offer them any other reason to be there either, right? How many employers actually offer any real on-the-job training? I mean, about the best most employers do is you get one free conference a year, and for that one free conference a year, we're going to give you a lot of hassle about actually getting reimbursed for it. That's like median for our industry. How in God's name is that median? That's bare minimum. But the problem is it's not just a matter of throwing money at it, because if you throw money at it, your program's going to go to OSCON, and then the money goes to O'Reilly, and you might as well just burn it. So they aren't the publisher I fired, by the way. So we need an actual profession. We need to become a profession. How many of you have the job title software engineer? How many of you is lying about being an engineer? We're not engineers, we're programmers. Talk to a real engineer sometime, a civil engineer. Find out what they had to do to get their job that earns about 1/3 of what you make. Find out what medical professionals have to do for their continuing education. Those people work way harder than all of us. All of us. I know programmers that complain if they're expected to do anything outside of their 9 to 5, ever once in their career. Medical professionals have to show up to conferences just to keep their license. But training makes business sense. This is something you can actually sell to your employer. You don't have to turn it into a class conflict. Probably not going to work anyway. I've tried that one. Got myself and a friend fired. Don't recommend it. Also, don't make yourself the rebel leader. They shoot you first. So, training makes business sense. Who here saw the movie Moneyball? I'm not going to ask about the book. None of you read it? Yep, okay. So Moneyball is it's about this baseball team. It's kind of boring, but the one good part is that this coach had this idea to find people who were systematically undervalued. And here's what I'm here to tell you. People that aren't experts, don't have an expertise, they are systematically undervalued because nobody's teaching them. And they don't even have to have a CS degree. They don't even have to be a programmer already. I've seen people with non-traditional backgrounds, I don't mean me, I grew up programming. I'm one of you, unfortunately. People who went to school for English, linguistics, history, the discipline that the field expected of them made them better programmers than programmers. How many of you play a musical instrument? How many of you are professional musicians? Right, find out how they practice. But, there's some conflict of incentives here, right? One problem is that we very rationally change jobs. Sometimes because it gets boring, sometimes because we can get a higher amount. My first real job doing software when I moved to New York made $40K a year, and I was living in Manhattan. I'm not that old, so that is low. The next job I got a year and a half later was $120K on contract, 1099. I tripled my income in a year and a half by changing jobs. I was offered a raise to $55K to stay. They did know what the other company was offering, for the record. All right, so I understand not going 120K, but really? All right, you just paid money to train me for a year and a half, but okay, right? Now, why am I naming numbers? We are not comfortable enough with talking to each other about compensation, about what companies are actually like. We should be more honest with each other about what actually goes on in our jobs. You can call it gossip, I don't really care. And even ignoring the fact that the company can get away with paying people less, which I guess wouldn't appeal to this audience that much, wouldn't you rather work at a company that actually cares about growing their people, that cares about having them develop? This is the attract talented people part, right? How much of your time when you first get hired on a job is spent learning the stuff particular to that company, a fair bit, right? I recently joined a company that has PHP. I have had the slowest month of my professional career at this company. And I've done PHP before. So if people keep leaving 1 year in, companies aren't even getting a whole year of productive time. That doesn't make sense. It's a waste. So this is a very smart man I found out about from a friend of mine on the way here, Anthony Grafton. He is a professor, I guess. I don't actually know how to talk about academics properly. I mean, I know postdoc is a thing, but hell if I know what that means. His thing is history of books, reading, and he has concerns about how people read today. We're not talking about programming anymore. It's just normal books, right? We read more text, but we're not really reading. We're not actually digesting something. It's like we're on a diet of Twinkies, right? This is not an original point. My point is that this is a general trend. If you wanted to, the first programming language I learned when I was a kid was GW Basic. We didn't have internet access. I had to learn it from a manual. Was it ideal? Was it efficient as it could have been? Maybe not. But I actually memorized the syntax, because otherwise I had to keep flipping through the book. The talk that I saw of Grafton's was Codex in Crisis. He gave the talk at Google in 2009. I strongly recommend you give it a listen, even if you think humanities people are nerds. Another problem is, I said, if you want to learn lens, learn the history. How are you going to do that? If you want to learn how Haskell was developed, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to find that? Most of the history and context is lost to us. It's just gone. We are a culture that forgets what happened 5 years ago, which is why programming languages like Golang, which haven't advanced beyond Algol 68, are currently popular. We're just going to keep repeating 1968 forever until we learn this lesson. I prefer to live now. So this is a problem that has been bothering me. And certainly there are people who would like a follow-on to Haskell book, right? This is what I'm doing next. You can't buy it. You can't read it. It doesn't exist yet. But this is my next thing. And I don't know if you've ever read an almanac, but this is basically descriptive of what it is. The angle is that it goes through libraries you might want to use if you're using Haskell. It's going to be biased to my needs as somebody that works on boring web apps. I apologize, but that's what I know best. And the focus is going to be on teaching you to use these libraries, not by giving you these pre-digested examples, like an O'Reilly cookbook. Rather, it's going to teach you how to learn to use the library from actually reading the code. But the real point is to teach you to read the code, to teach you to read code. I know I'm a little over time, but bear with me. I want to share a quick anecdote with you about practice. So, how many of you ever read folklore.org? Anybody? Okay, cool. Some uber nerds in here with me. Awesome. All right. So folklore.org is this compendium of anecdotes from the team that developed the Macintosh, the first one, back before many of you were born, and me, to be fair. And there's some really great anecdotes. And one of my favorite ones is make a mess, clean it up. And it was about, they had this arcade cabinet of this game called Defender. It looked like this. Most of you have seen something like Space Invaders or something similar, right? They used to just, people working on the Mac, they worked a lot of hours, right? So they would just go to the building that had the arcade machine to kind of de-stress. And eventually it started becoming a competition, this game. They would see who could get the highest high score. And what happened was they noticed that one of the members of the team seemed to do a lot better, and they started kind of crowding around and watching what he was doing. So the way Defender works is you're flying a ship around, and you're trying to shoot aliens before they capture your 10 humans. If the aliens manage to kidnap your humans and lift them to the top of the screen, they turn into mutants, and the mutants move much faster and more aggressively than the aliens. So usually the way you lose the game is that you fail to protect enough humans, they turn into mutants, and the mutants kill you because they move faster than the aliens. That's usually the end game, right? What happened was this employee, he was shooting all of his humans at the very start of the game, which turns them into mutants instantly. So he had 10 mutants swarming around him the whole time. And in the process of doing that, what he learned how to do was to evade the mutants effectively and to corral them, kind of like, any of you ever played Diablo? How you would kind of corral the herds of mobs? Wow, that's way fewer hands than I expected. Lord, all right. Some of you have some culture to catch up on. Forget Moby Dick, play Diablo, come on. Ugh. Anyway, because he did this, he learned how to deal with the end game better. Accordingly, you're not going to become a better programmer by writing the same web app in 20 different programming languages. Do something else. If only so the people you're asking help from won't die of boredom. Just do something more interesting. Do something more difficult. Implement a programming language. Write your own database. Write like a barely functional SQLite clone. That's much harder than it sounds. You will learn more about SQL databases and durability in that project than you will reading 10,000 pages of manual. That's all. Thank you for your time.